Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, The Impact of New Technologies on Treasury and Finance. We will be discussing different technologies treasuries use and best practices for getting the most out of your systems. Our presenters today include Jeff DiOrio, a director and co-head of Treasury Strategies. Jeff has worked for many of the Treasury technology vendors over the last 30 years and leads the technology side of the practice. Colin McAlpine, a principal in Treasury Strategies. Colin has a background in foreign exchange, corporate treasury, and has worked as a domain specialist at several TMS vendors. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This session is going to be 45 minutes long. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session, and we'll leave time at the end for a Q&A. Please submit any questions in the Q&A window at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a recording link and a copy of the presentation following the webinar. Jeff?
Thank you, Katie. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff DiOrio, and I'm joined by my partner in crime here, Colin McAlpine. So why don't we just jump right in? We've been asked a lot of questions recently about the state of the TMS marketplace, and in addition, about some of the other technologies people are using. What's exciting now is, whereas a few years ago, SaaS technology was really evolving, these days, a majority of the solutions that you might tap into are SaaS available. So we're going to be reviewing what technologies people are using and the TMS marketplace, and in addition, how you can get value from things.
Sure, and then we're also going to be talking about some of the new technologies that we're seeing some of our clients use and experience, and how they're using different types of technology to try and optimize their function and their procedures, both within the Treasury Department and also the wider Finance Department.
Right, so today's session, we'll be covering three main areas. We're going to look at some of the new technologies. We'll focus on dashboarding, robotics processing, and AI. Then we'll be looking at many of the existing offerings, what's going on in the Treasury management technology marketplace, and then what to think about as you're selecting and implementing new technologies, because a lot of people have shared with us their frustration in not getting the value that they would like to get. So we're going to give you some really good tips and tricks towards the end there. Okay, so we did a study on technology treasuries are using with the NACT at the beginning of the year. And what we'd like to do is, even though we went over a large variety of items, we want to talk about the top three technologies that treasuries are using. And we're going to do them in order of priority. So dashboarding tools are the number one of the newer technologies that people are using. You can see on the right, upper right there, that we've got a pie chart. We asked three questions. We said, are you using this technology today? Are you planning to use it? Or you're not using it and you don't plan to use it? You can see that you've got well over an 80% of people that are either using it or planning to use it. And we see this as a very positive thing. One of the big uses for it is to gather information and present it. And you know, some people said, well, we use our TMS for that, or we use our ERP for that. But a lot of people will note that the data they need to look at is actually present in multiple systems. And so these tools allow you to, without going too crazy, reach into multiple data sources and present a really nice dashboard for finance use. The other point to be made about this is the technology is really quite mature at this point and is readily available. So whereas years ago everybody was using Excel for just about everything, this is a case where this data might work, and Excel is one of the options here clearly, but there are some other tools available like Tableau, Microsoft Power BI, They're very, very easy to use. You don't need to have an IT specialist necessarily configuring and maintaining these for you if your team are reasonably conversant in technologies. So also a point to be made here is combining things like robotic processing really helps bring this to the forefront, because if you're gathering data from multiple sources, in some cases you need something that will go and get the data, bring it in, and potentially transform it a little bit, enhance it so that you can see things the way you want to see them. And so you see here we've got use cases and technologies that are being used. On the use cases side, for Treasury and Finance, there's many others, but for Treasury and Finance, we see people, some people use it for cash positioning. I see it used very extensively for forecasting, working capital visualization. Working capital is a hot topic, as is forecasting this year and in this coming year. And so these tools are used to present that information. And on the right-hand side, you can see some of the technologies that people said they were using for this. So this is a survey-based information for you. And as Colin will point out, Excel is still in the mix here. So it is something that it technically is a business intelligence tool, but you have to be careful with it, because you can create a monster that's very difficult to manage, and that's why some people are moving to some of these other technologies like Tableau, ClickView, Power BI. Colin, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, so many practitioners, and I was there a number of years ago, on a monthly or quarterly basis, you're often, preparing a Treasury deck presentation to give to senior management, to, be it the CFO, to the board, etc. And yes, traditionally that was always Excel, and you're combining everything. And as Jeff pointed out, now with these new technologies, you can have some far more flexibility and functionality in creating that dashboard, those presentations. But also when we look at those use cases, those historical, those kind of quarterly presentations and monthly presentations you would do would often be combining every single one of those use cases. And that's now where this new dashboarding functionality software, and also what the TMS vendors are also putting into their software, allows you to actually use that data to kind of quickly combine and create dashboards, and therefore not having to kind of take stuff out and put it into Excel to manipulate it. A lot of the vendors, a lot of this software are now creating really upstream high professional visualization of the data that you can get from your relative software.
Thank you, Colin. So the next item, the number 2 poll holder here is robotics process automation, or RPA. And this is a bit of a dual-edged sword, and I will talk about that in a moment. But on the upper right, you'll see not as wide adoption as dashboarding. Fewer people are using it today. People are definitely planning to use it and looking at ways to adopt it. A few years ago, people were telling me that they saw much more application for it around things like AR automation, but we're definitely seeing a lot of good use cases in Treasury these days. The primary use for this is where you're automating repetitive and predictive tasks, so things that can be automated, where perhaps data is being moved, or data needs to be moved and data needs to be enhanced. So gathering data, creating a cache position, very, very viable way to do it. We see it getting used for forecasting and report creation and distribution. So simple things like forecasting, getting data from the bank. Well, forecasting is not simple, but getting data into the forecast so that you can manipulate it. And then other use cases are listed here. On the technology side, we've got a listing of what people talked about using. But notice again, Excel macros, RPA robotics processing really is just automating something, and if you think about it as just a more robust macro, that's what it is. So there are definitely some tools you have very probably in-house today to do this if you're using the Microsoft suite. Two items in gray were items that our survey participants did not mention, but that we did know a lot of people were using. So Pega and another mud are examples of those. Just wanted to make sure that we were presenting some actionable information. Colin, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things. Again, you're quite right, Jeff, in where we're seeing some clients use RPA. And always remember, there's really kind of two types of RPA. There's what they call attended robots only, where you're still having some manual intervention, say through a process, or you've got completely unattended RPA, so that the entire process that you're looking to automate is done for you completely. So you're not having to watch it. And where we've seen a few of our clients use kind of this idea of RPA, and most of the time I've seen it really, it's kind of still attended, so someone's still watching the process a little bit, but is where people, as Jeff mentioned, creating cash position worksheets in the morning. They're not using a TMS necessarily for various reasons that we've discussed with our clients, but what they're doing is they're downloading data from a banking portal. They need to get those files, they need to save them to a directory, they subsequently need to then kind of put that data into Excel, funny enough, and then run some macros and some data to kind of bring it out to a view that they will look at for cash positioning. And that's where we've seen some RPAs being used quite effectively and efficiently by our clients.
Yeah, and the last point I want to make on this is there is a dark side to it. So we interviewed one treasurer this year, and she said, we did a big RPA study, and we analyzed where we could apply RPA to improve our processes. And we determined that we should really improve a bunch of our processes before we considered putting RPA in. So there is that aspect of it. You know, you may have to automate a process that's not working efficiently, but in some cases, looking at the process itself is a viable thing. The other aspect of this is there is a support requirement for it. So yes, it's a really neat tool. But as soon as other systems that it's interacting with upgrade, or if something changes and the processes break, you need to maintain them. And so you need to factor the ongoing maintenance of these into your decision to use them. And it's not a bad thing. It's just something to make sure that you've done so that you continue to get good value from them. Moving on to our number 3 contestant, artificial intelligence. We all use artificial intelligence. The most viable example I can think of is when our credit card companies call us up to say, somebody's buying groceries in Yugoslavia with your card today, is that you? And what they've done is they have applied something that does anomalous transaction detection that has noted that there's a transaction that falls outside your standard behavior. And that technology is available for Treasury. It's become much more mature. You can see that fewer people are actually deploying it today, but a larger number are planning to use it, so that everybody is looking at this. And there are, again, this is the lowest adoption of the top 3, but there are some really, really nice technologies out there. What are treasuries using it for? What are treasuries and finance using it for? Well, they're using it primarily for 2 big things, I think. The fraud mitigation, which is a number 1 risk that every treasurer says they're concerned about, and then for proactive analysis. So it's kind of both a positive and a negative. It's avoiding bad stuff and then making your life a little easier. The payment fraud mitigation, there's some really nice technologies out there. The banks offer it, right? So you don't necessarily need to bring something in-house to use it. There's a very good chance that your bank provider is using it naturally, and also may offer some enhanced service for using it. If you're using certain payment providers, TMS providers, they have it built into what they do in many cases. And then there's technologies you can just bring in-house, and they work they work really well. One of the ones noted at the very bottom here, Splunk, has a utility you just point at a directory, and this is called unattended. Many of them have this unattended, where it just watches what goes through there, and then eventually it starts saying, hey, I haven't seen that before. That's different. On the positive, for proactive analysis, one of the things I really like about it is for forecasting. Everybody's looking for that magic bullet that makes their forecasting better. And if you can get a good, consistent historical data source and apply AI to it, it can help you project what's going on. And there's many other cases here for this. Colin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you mentioned, it's still the lower of the three kind of take-ups that we're seeing, but we are again talking to some clients that are using a couple of bits of software in terms of using AI to support reconciliation process in the AR and the AP. You mentioned, which is the kind of the key one around fraud prevention, and you're quite right that the banks have it, but if you're bringing it in-house, as you said, you're actually kind of looking at that validation or inconsistency of payments before you're sending something to the bank. So you're going to get some benefit. And again, that's where a lot of the TMS vendors, or if you're using third-party payment suppliers to support payments, you're seeing they're using AI to kind of look at trends on how you make payments to certain suppliers, values, etc. So they can warn you if there's an unusual spike in either the value of a payment or the number of payments that you're making to a supplier.
Thanks, Colin. So there were other categories here, blockchain and some other things. Obviously, those are important, but we have limited time today, so if you'd like more information on that, do reach out to us. Now we'll transition over to the Treasury Technology Marketplace. What's going on with vendor offerings and what non-TMS systems people are focusing on. So first thing to note is this is not a comprehensive list of TMS systems, but we did want to give a very good sample. We've rated them, well, they're listed alphabetically so that there's no question of bias or anything like that. One point, I think, Colin, you've got a couple of thoughts on this, so let you go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, just to talk about, it's not a comprehensive list. It is a number of the vendors that we tend to see cropping up quite a bit when we talk to our clients and prospects. And as we mentioned earlier through the kind of the initial slides, all these vendors now, a lot of them are now SaaS-based. And so that kind of gives a lot of opportunity and benefit to clients of these vendors in that quite often they are doing 2 major upgrades a year. Often there might be monthly patches that are being done to improve, obviously, their offering and their functionality to their clients. And because they're all SaaS-based, obviously that really takes out the work that you have to do when using these particular vendors and software. And also a lot of the vendors as well, they're doing, I think, some really nice things in terms of giving their clients access to make recommendations of where they'd like to see enhancements or where they see a bug. A lot of them have kind of client portal logins to put requests in. And we're seeing that the vendors are becoming very, very responsive in providing feedback to ideas that their clients are providing. So I think there's a lot of great things that are happening. And as I said, as well as that area in terms of the vendors, with their upgrades, their enhancements kind of twice a year, they're continually improving the functionality they're going to give in their core modules. And we touched upon one just recently, and I think it's such an important one, which is payment fraud. A lot of these vendors are now doing more and more to help you in a preventative way before you kind of send payments from your TMS than, historically a few years ago.
Yes, thank you, Colin. Another point to be made is there's a wide range of functionality here. So you have to match what your requirements are with the capabilities of the vendor. And so you can have, to use a car analogy, you could have a pickup truck or you could have an 18-wheeler. You've got everything in between. So you could have a simple cash solution. You could have a very, very large global system. These things can cover all of that. You just need to make sure you're looking at the right one. There has been a lot of good investment in the space recently. And so there's a lot of opportunity if you're thinking that you want a specific treasury management system. Having said that, TMSs aren't all there is to look at these days, is there, Colin?
No, and that's right. And so, again, not wanting to show my age, but I remember my very first TMS system way back at the end of the 90s, and and that didn't really do too much, quite frankly. It kind of served the purpose that we needed, but wasn't really providing too much more than being a kind of really a diary in a way to kind of log some interest accruals. And so obviously what we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years, however far you want to go back, is, as we mentioned, a continual expansion of the services that the TMS vendors can provide to their clients. But what we're also seeing now is, with the kind of the rise of fintech, is that you can get very specialized SaaS-based software, particularly for certain key or very specialized requirements that you're looking for. And again, with the rise of APIs, everyone is making sure that their technology can talk to other technology as easily as they can. And so that when you look at your requirements for technology, and everyone's continuing to say, how can I optimize or automate my processes, and obviously technology kind of comes up there, you don't necessarily now have to consider, what does my TMS vendor provide for me, or my ERP provider give me. You can say, well, I've got that and I've got that, but also now there's this specialized software here, and how could they help me in terms of trying to drive more efficiency across the requirements and across our sort of our daily positioning or our monthly reporting requirements.
Yes, and so I would like to spend at least a little more time talking about what some of these do, because there are organizations where they say, I would love to buy a treasury management system, but I can't get authorization for that, or they have one and they just need it to work more efficiently or tie in better with things. We are seeing the ERPs being used more and more frequently, the modules that do treasury, that do cash positioning, and some of the other activities. We are seeing more activity in that space. Obviously, for the RPA examples and gathering data and putting it in dashboards, software transformative softwares where it grasps data, it can get it, it can transform it, it can present it into a database or some other mechanism. Those are popular, and they're necessary, because if you're talking about tying 3 or 4 different systems and technologies together, you may have to transform data. The bank communications continue to evolve. We're very excited about the new API initiatives and the additional enhanced, enriched data you'll be able to send to a bank and get from a bank. So we're really excited about that. There are specialty vendors out there that do things like bank fee analysis or exposure collection, and so there's a lot of those available. On the outsourcing side, these are organizations that treasuries use to take care of foreign exchange and certain other things like that. The trading and settlement technologies have evolved very nicely, so your ability to go out and execute and settle and reconcile, all of that, get data, is all enhanced. And then you'll notice that we've got AP and AR listed, because those are 2 areas that are becoming much more important to treasurers, because treasurers tend to be focused recently, not that they haven't in the past, but working capital management does seem to be something that's getting a lot of attention these days, because if you can adjust that by just a few days, you could have a massive impact on your organization. Any other thoughts before we move on, Colin?
I think we've kind of covered this area. And obviously, some of these more specialized areas we have seen around for the last few years, I think, sort of trading settlement side, are much more kind of interlinked with TMS vendors. But we are, as we mentioned, seeing more and more coming out that are giving you those opportunities to be very specific. And so, when we start kind of talking about the next couple of slides in terms of if you're going to be something about a selection or maybe just kind of looking to replace existing technology, one of the things to think about is actually what do you really need to do? And we're going to touch upon that in the next couple of slides.
Thank you. So one of the areas that we get into, and this came up this year, Treasurer said to me, I'm getting a lot of questions about how well my technology works for me. And so we did a study because we're hearing a lot of that. And quite frankly, a lot of the work we're doing these days is on optimizing technologies people already have. So we conducted a study to inquire as to how satisfied organizations were with their technology investment, and also what best-in-class organizations were doing to maximize the value they were getting. On this page, you'll see the two pyramids. These have been around for quite a while. I remember seeing them back in the 90s. So the concept here is that when you do an analysis of the work that people are doing in Treasury and Finance, you will find that 80% of the effort involved there does tend to be gathering data, manipulating it, and putting it into something so that you can figure out what's going on and take action on it. And the concept of automation is to give you efficiency in doing that specific thing, enhancing your control. We talked about payment fraud before. We are seeing a lot of focus on that, ways to use not just training and better workflow and processes, but using technology to add control, and then new capabilities. So, is there something you need that is just, pretty difficult for somebody to put together? And in years past, it's been things like hedge accounting. That's been something where good technology really does help. But in this webinar that we've been giving, we've already talked about forecasting. There are ways to do a better job of figuring out what you've got and leveraging technology to enhance your forecasting.
Yeah, and I would just, probably add to kind of Jeff's comments about what we're doing a lot with our clients now. And it is when clients have gone through the process of implementing technology, of implementing software, you kind of are towards more the left-hand side, the current state. So what you're doing is really getting your technology to help you get that data collection, and as it says, kind of start making tactical activities, and then a smaller portion strategic. So what we're trying to do when we're working with our clients in looking at utilization and optimizing of their technology is to actually flip these triangles that you can see them, so that we still try and look to say, coming back to the things we've talked about RPAs and AI, etc., how can we drive more efficiency in that data collection part so that you've got more time? That's really what we're talking about here, is just time. How do you create more time to invest in tactical activities and strategic activities? Because also bear in mind, again, as a long-term practitioner, it's much more fun when you're working your way through a Treasury department as an analyst or a Treasury manager, wherever you may be. You want to spend more time supporting your AT or your treasurer in those tactical activities, in helping give them that information, as opposed to just kind of generating and churning out the data collected for someone else then to do that work for you.
Thanks, Colin. So, as I said, the question that the point the treasurer had made to me was that when the doors close, most people ask, are you getting value from your technology? One of the questions we asked was, how satisfied are you with the value you're getting from your technology? And 80% of respondents went, it works pretty good. It's okay. It's doing what we need it to do. But only 20% were really happy that they were getting the value, all of the value that they thought they could get from the system. And when we dug into that, we found that 5% of the respondents were really best in class. They did a lot of really proactive things to make sure that they maximized the utility of the technology they had. And So, as Colin pointed out a little earlier, we've been doing an awful lot of work optimizing systems. So organizations are never given enough money to buy things and put them in, or to staff your treasury with fully staffed, fully utilized people. So there's always a compromise in what you're going to get done. And we're seeing organizations that, it does take a little bit more effort to really get the systems up and running, train everybody on how to use them, and maximize them. We've actually got a white paper on this, so if you're interested in it, we'd be happy to share it with you. But the concept that there's probably more you can do with what you have today is a very viable concept. In some cases, yes, you should rip and replace, but in others, there's a very good chance that you could either restructure how you do things and restructure the systems you're using to get much, much better value. So Colin did a speech at the AFP this year with Levi's and MTD, two clients of ours, and they covered how to maximize the value from systems. Colin?
Yes, so absolutely. So when we look at kind of the 3 steps we've got there, so we did spend a little bit of time on each of these steps. So step 1, we've kind of alluded this to a couple of points for this presentation. So again, when we think about that objectives definition that we talk about, it's really important to kind of consider what is it you're actually trying to do, not just now, but also in the future state as well. So you can think about, what are you doing manually right now? What is your department doing that you could consider could be improved either by, a TMS or some very specialized software? And it's very important to get all of that documented. And MTD talked about actually that when they were involved through this process, that they kind of recognized they didn't have any technology at all as a global operation. They were looking to kind of roll off of Excel and get in and work with a new TMS vendor, and some other software that we've actually looked at earlier, they've also installed in a couple of other their finance departments. But they realized they didn't necessarily have some of that experience or the time within their team. So they actually opted to get a third party to come and aid them in terms of writing out their business requirements. Because what that would do is then allow them to kind of efficiently write an RFP for vendors to respond to. So you're making sure you're giving the correct weighting that you want in terms of your requirements. Because as Jeff mentioned earlier, if you think about just a TMS vendor, they can all pretty much do everything you're looking to do, but some of them have greater skills or detail in certain key modules, let's say. So therefore, it's very important to write your RFP and make sure you're then targeting the right vendors, be it a TMS or some of the wider vendors we've looked at in that technology stage. So that's kind of when you're thinking about what you're doing there in terms of your either your existing technology or you want to put new technology in. And that's when kind of step 2 with this technology review and redesign. Again, Levi's talked about this a little bit as well. They were very clear about what they had and essentially what wasn't working for them. And also when looking at the respective vendors, how could they actually utilize a multi-vendor environment through a new implementation? So they were kind of quite forward thinking when they went through that a few years ago, which is kind of very interesting. And then I've just lost my mouse a little bit here. So then when we look very much at the third part here, the implementation of the optimization, again, when you're looking back at this previous slide where you've got some of our clients and those in the survey saying they've only got 80% really, or less than 80% are saying they're not really getting the use of their technology. That is not a reflection on the Treasury departments, the people involved, or the vendors. It's often a case of time, budget, etc. that's been done. And what we've got to consider here is that if you can spend a lot more time at the front end here at step 1 and step 2, you're actually giving yourself the correct roadmap, the design, to actually efficiently implement and optimize the technology you're looking to do. And a great example is all the will in the world, when you're going through your process of business design and saying, this is what we need, let's say for our financial transactions, as you get in, if you design that and put a good design document in terms of workflow and reporting requirements, where the data is going to come from, inevitably when you get through implementation, again, this has came up in our speech at the AFP, you don't know what you don't know still in terms of the technology or the vendors that you've actually brought in to help you implement. And you might find some new bits and pieces within their technology that actually can support you. So then you can very quickly redesign your workflow to aid that. Obviously, not always quite as good, but conversely, if you find out that there's a little bit of a roadblock, how you can work out a workaround quite quickly. So that's where, if you really kind of invest in time, I think, in steps 1 and step 2, step 3 should be easier. And therefore, you wouldn't be sitting in that previous slide where kind of 80% of the survey respondents said they weren't really getting value for money. You'd be coming up straight up into the greater 20% at that point.
Thank you, Colin. That totally agree with every point you made. So to recap, right, why set objectives and do design first? And I can tell you that 20 years ago when I ran client services for one of the TMS vendors, we would do an implementation by sitting down with the client saying, this is how the technology works. Now, try and configure this module, and then we'll go on to the next one. And we found that that methodology, more often than not, did not result in happy clients fully utilizing the system. And so there's two things here. You don't follow that example. Don't learn something and then figure out how to implement it. Have your business requirements very well defined before you start, and that will help guide you, as Colin's pointed out, in the deployment of that technology. You can say, well, all right, we're learning about this, but let's all remember this is what we want it to do. So having that roadmap before you start is important. Another thing is a treasurer I met, first thing he said to me when he came in was, I know we're doing an implementation. I don't want to automate a broken process. So making sure that your processes are future-proof, that you have evaluated that maybe the way you're doing things aren't as efficient as you'd like them to be, and now that you're putting this system or you're optimizing what you've got in place, maybe you want to look at how you're doing things and see if that can evolve. And that has to evolve. Just the fraud attempts alone are going to change the way the Treasury operation and the AP operation work, because these exploits continue to evolve, and so your response to protect your organization has to evolve. So you will naturally have to go through a process of constantly reviewing what you're doing, how you're doing it, and how you can leverage technology to enhance it. So we do like this concept of steps 1 and 2 where you're spending some time up front. That helps. And then when you get to the implementation of the optimization, as Colin pointed out, sometimes it's just budget, but at least you've got a plan. And if you can't get it all done in the initial go-round, have a phase 2. And that's why we're spending so much time. We're doing more optimizations right now than we're doing brand new implementations or pull-out and replacements. And I think the reason for that is a lot of organizations realize they can get a lot more out of what they've already invested in. So there is a bit of a cost impact there where they're trying to avoid it. But getting all of these systems, getting yourself from 80% back up into that 5% is the key here, and we think it's possible. And certainly a lot of organizations agree with us, because we're being engaged to take organizations from basic cash positioning and simple forecasting up into the upper realms of that with their automation. Okay, well, I haven't seen that many questions come through, so we'd like to wrap up now and talk about some upcoming events. We've been very busy this year, so we've not done that many webinars. You will see more webinars next year. The very next one we're doing is the State of the Treasury Profession. We do it every year in late February. There will be a survey, so if you're interested in participating in that and then seeing how your answers match up against everybody else's, look for that survey to come out in January. We'll be emailing it and posting it on LinkedIn and other ways that you'll know that it's available. We'll also be interviewing treasurers, and then the webinar will convey the results, which we find fascinating every single year. The other item that we're looking to do in the near term is to talk about some new strategies around working capital. Working capital has been a very, very important item in last year's State of the Treasury. It was the number one thing that treasurers said they were tasking their people with. In our update before the AFP, when we interviewed treasurers to say, what have you put on your 2020 list, many of them said we're looking to optimize working capital. And so we're going to do a webinar on optimizing the cash conversion cycle. So look for that as well.
Yeah, great. And just a recap from the start, we will be emailing the presentation to those that have been attending the webinar.
Yes, thank you. And it will be available on the internet. So thank you. We appreciate your attending this session. And if you have any questions, please do reach out and ask. Our emails are at the very beginning of the session.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.